introduce Tim Bird, who I've worked with for a very long time actually in open source from the early days of ARM embedded, when people say, ARM, Linux, what? So Tim works for Sony and represents Sony on the Linux Foundation Self Committee project, and he's a good guy, so I look forward to his talk.
Good morning, everyone. Very happy to be here. I don't have these external talks are pretty short, and this is a topic, interacting with the community, that you could spend an awful lot of time on. Many people have over the years. I just want to go through, give you some perspective really quickly, what I think about, well, I want to answer this fundamental question. How can the ARM Linux community be more influential? This is something David and I were talking about before this event. And before I answer that question, I kind of want to go on a little bit of a sidetrack. So how can you not be influential? Well, here's some key things to avoid being influential in the community. One is to stick to yourself, solve only your own problems, and the best way to not be influential in the community is to develop a bunch of stuff behind closed doors and then just dump it over the wall. So you may be thinking, hey, wait a minute, isn't that what Android did? And they're like wildly successful, so what are you talking about, Tim? Well, let's talk about the Android case a little bit. So Android, has been accused of forking. That's kind of a loaded word because of the whole Unix heritage. But Android did what lots of companies and projects do. They develop first, and they ask questions later. So, there's a lot of, hindsight is 20/20. You can go back and you can say, well, could the Android developers have talked to the Linux community a little bit earlier in the development cycle? Well, yes, certainly they could have. Overall, there's a lot of stuff that they couldn't discuss. And there's a couple of reasons. Linux is really only a small part. If you look at how big Android is, it's the size of Windows these days. In terms of, well, it's probably not as size as Windows 7 code base, but it's big. And it's a huge distribution. They got some Java stuff going on, and Linux really is a small part of their effort. The Android team is fairly small. Corporate secrecy is what it is. Google didn't want to tip its hand about a lot of the stuff it was doing. And to some degree, nobody expected this level of success. And so, hindsight, if you're going to be so successful, you should have talked to us earlier. It's like, well, how did we know? But the success of Android has started to kind of change this notion of upstream first. So there's this really big drive to make sure you do stuff first out in the community, get community feedback on it, and of course that's really good. But Android's success has kind of challenged that notion. So you can have success without doing that. Of course, in the mobile market, there's all these other external factors that contribute to the success of a product. And so it's not really whether or not you went upstream first that determines your success. And in reality, very few things are purely upstream first. Every idea for anything starts in the head of some developer. And you start to work on it, and you might start to prototype it, and you hope that you don't get it all the way out into a product that's in 100 million hands before you actually tell the Linux community about it. But at some point, there's always some point in the development of an idea and an implementation where it starts internally, and then you go approach other people about it. And also, you have to be really careful applying analogies from Android to the rest of the product lines, because Android is not your typical product, right? It's got the backing of a billion-dollar company. So don't be careful making the assertion that what applies to Android can apply to your project. But there is this notion that building consensus in the Linux community is too slow when you're building a product. And I have to defend the Android developers on this. There's no way that they could have, in my opinion, taken the time to carefully discuss with the community all the ins and outs of their approaches and waited for the results to get mainlined before they went out the door. They don't have time for protracted discussions. It's actually, for some things, it can be very costly. And cleaning up post-shipment is a royal pain. And talking about this consensus issue, There's a perception that achieving consensus in the community blocks or delays progress. Well, that's true for some things. For other things, it's not really that bad. We've noticed, I think, recently, a lot more board support work in ARM has been able to migrate up to the mainline community without a lot of barriers. There's always a lot of discussion when stuff goes on, and especially with some of the churn in the architecture tree. One of the key things to identify here or observe is that really there's no such thing as a monolithic community. When you go out with a piece of code that you're trying to submit to the kernel developers, you don't have to please all of them in most cases. Really, the Linux community is divided into lots of little small subgroups. If you have a patch that affects networking, you really only need to talk to the networking subcommunity. If you have something that has to do with file systems, you talk to the file systems community. And so in reality, you don't have to please everyone. You can actually have a lot of naysayers about your code and still get code upstream if you just convince the maintainer. And so the maintainer is trying to build consensus. That's kind of his job, but he's also trying to do the right thing. In general, the smaller the code area, the smaller the group that cares about what you're doing. So sometimes, here's the areas where you run into problems. Sometimes there's no maintainer. So I happen to be working right now on the Android logger code, trying to get it mainlined. And there's no maintainer for logging systems in the kernel because there wasn't one. We had the kernel printk messages and stuff. So when there's no maintainer, that's when a lot of people will chime in with opinions, and you have kind of a consensus deadlock. Sometimes something touches everything, and you're talking about having to fan out this consensus building to a huge group, and that's what happened with wake locks, why that didn't get in. There's a social order to the community that you need to kind of understand in order to interact with them. So your ways are not my ways. So the community is kind of a different thing, especially if you're coming from, in my example, I work for Sony. We have a very different internal culture about intellectual property than the community does. And this is something that we have to continually train people on, how to interact. So you need to spend time learning the practices. One thing that's kind of interesting is that when the Amish is a kind of a religious order in the United States, they're famous for how they build barns. They're very efficient at it. They build barns as a community. And they don't, it turns out, communicate very much between themselves when they're building a barn. Everybody just shows up and does their job, and they all know, it comes from training and experience, but they have this shared vision of what the barn's going to look like. They don't go in with plans. They don't have a foreman. Everybody just shows up, they build a barn, and they leave. And they usually get it done in a day. It's pretty amazing. There's an efficiency that you achieve from interacting with the community at a certain rate. If you're too slow, if you only are sporadically interacting with the community, then there's a kind of a high cost you pay in relearning the practices every time. And I kind of have this myself. I don't do a whole lot of kernel development. Unfortunately, I do a lot of kind of managerial type things at Sony. And I'm constantly relearning. It's like, okay, how do I get rebase again? And what check patch, where is that? That's in scripts. I got to run check patch against my patches. There's a whole bunch of kind of minutia that ties you up. And kind of being more consistent about interacting with the community is helpful. In terms of expertise, there's a myth that code merit trumps everything. That if your code is not perfect, it will not go in. But that's not true. Bad stuff flows into the kernel all the time, trust me. What trumps code meritocracy is trust. If people trust that you're in it for the long haul, that you're willing to maintain your stuff over time, then code can go in. And it's actually good to have code that's not quite baked in there. And that's what Linux staging, there's a staging directory in the kernel tree, and Linux Next is for shaking out some quality issues. Different parts of the kernel have different quality bars. You know, the bar for changing something in the scheduler is quite high. The bar for changing something in some miscellaneous driver is quite low. Being an expert in your subject matter really pays off in the long haul. So although there is this kind of myth about meritocracy, if you can demonstrate that you're an expert at what you're doing, eventually people will listen to you, but you do have to be persistent about it. And then in terms of expertise, there was kind of a big clash when the Android guys finally did show up on the kernel, in the kernel community. Both the Android developers and the kernel developers obviously knew what the best way forward was. Unfortunately, it was not the same best way forward, and that caused a lot of clashes. So Linaro, I think, is a great enabler. Linaro enables all kinds of neat stuff. I'll tell you this at the end also as kind of my big wrap-up, but I think Linaro is doing a great job. It's easier to do hardware usage, and I say that with my Sony hat on. So I kind of work in the industry, but I also am a developer. It is just really nice to be able to go out and get some of the things that Linaro is providing. Neat tools for everyone, lots of efficiencies, a lot of issues being dealt with. So the other thing that Linaro could be argued to be enabling is bad behavior, right? Are you making me, as a developer, soft and lazy because I don't have to do these things? Well, maybe a little bit, but I'm not going to complain too much about that. If Linaro is out there doing Android mainlining for Google, does it take the pressure off Google to do their own community work? Well, that's something we always worry about. You don't want to do too much for other people. You want them to really develop the expertise in-house. But the reality is, I think for the foreseeable future, Google is not going to have some really strongly community-facing guys. And so I think it's an important function for the industry going forward, that we continue to work on stuff together. So what we end up doing in the Android case is what I call mining. So it turns out that the Android guys were really, really sharp. And they did a lot of neat stuff that they did not end up pushing back into the rest of the community. Their entire user space is not the standard embedded Linux user space. And their kernel, they kind of diverged, if you want to call it a fork. But we can start mining. There's great stuff in there. And that's what I've been doing recently, as I've been essentially mining Android. So there's a mainline interest group. There's people in this room and in the community who are working on trying to get those patches upstream from Android to kind of undiverge that code base. There's another personal project that I'm working on. Is Android has actually a really good crash handler. That's really appropriate for embedded, and I've been trying to see if I can pull some of those bits out and use it in other embedded projects. Mining is dirty, hard work, and I note that in the early days, California is a gold rush state. Miners had very low life expectancy, but someone's got to do it, and it's actually rewarding. Sometimes you stumble across that gold nugget that's really valuable. So, how to be influential. If you're going to work with the community, share early and often. Overshare. Be kind of like Facebook. Tell people, what you're doing. See others' needs and address them. This is the one that's most counterintuitive. A lot of times in business is about competition, but the community is not about competition. It's about helping other people. And the irony here, or the paradox, is that the more that you address other people's needs, the more that your needs will be addressed by them. In a kind of a Zen thing, that's not that hard to believe, or not unbelievable, but that's really the way it works in the community. So, as hard as it may be, if you're a bunch of ARM developers, you do actually have to consider, what does Intel need? So think about that as you're making your advancements to the kernel. The other thing is target maintainers. So you don't have to convince everybody in the community, you just have to convince the maintainer. If you can't kind of convince the maintainers, well, you can just go hire them if they're available. It's really hard to find available maintainers these days. And this is not just cynical. This is not, you don't hire a maintainer and then just tell them, oh, get this in. No, you hire a maintainer and you trust them to get into the kernel what will ultimately be the best thing for your product. And then use experts from your community. Use people who are experts in the community process. So I started this, and I don't know if you realized, but I've been giving the wrong presentation the whole time. I said moving forward with the community. And the implicit in that phrasing is kind of an us-them mentality, that somehow you're different from the community. And the reality is you're not. You are the community. You're as much a member of the broader Linux community as anyone else out there. And you need to never act like second-class citizens. You need to be involved in decisions that will advance Linux for everyone. So the correct title of this should have been Moving Forward as a Community. Where do we go from here? I think Linaro is doing great work. I think you're doing a fabulous job. I'm really happy to see the Linaro organization and the things that you're producing. And don't stop forking the kernel and taking it in new directions. That's beneficial for everyone. So I appreciate your time.